So Canada's Green Party is the first party out of the gate this election with a detailed accounting of its election promises. Green Party leader Elizabeth May joins me now from Halifax. Elizabeth May, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
Thanks, Peter.
So before we get into some of the details of these promises and the costing around them, I want you to start perhaps by giving us a sense of the principles that form the foundation of this platform and the promises you're making.
Well, that's a wonderful question. We believe in being transparent with Canadians. We're deeply grateful to the Parliamentary Budget Office. We submitted 24 planks, if you will, different elements of our platform. We started meeting with PBO back in May. But our fundamental principle is this. We need to spend more money as a government, but we don't want Canadians to worry that we're compromising their fiscal future in order to secure climate security. So, and also to expand social programs, because Canada must bring in universal pharmacare. We need to give our kids a better start in life and that they're not indebted. So we want to abolish tuition and invest more in post-secondary education. And we want to ensure childcare. So our promises aren't small. They're overdue. A lot of politicians have promised them before. But we have new revenue line items. And it's also the revenue piece is what we really needed Parliamentary Budget Office help.
Okay,
so our goal was to have a balanced budget on the same time frame as the Conservatives and show people how we get there.
Okay, so you touched on some of the big ticket spending items. Let's talk about some of the costing, the revenue side, and how you're going to pay for some of these big promises. So what are the key ways? What should Canadians expect to pay more for or see disappear, if that's the way to frame it, to pay for some of these promises that you're putting before them?
Well, clearly, fossil fuel subsidies disappear, and that's about $3 billion a year benefit. The $10 to $13 billion that the Liberals have committed Canadians to for building a pipeline that should not be built, that doesn't have a commercial market and represents blowing our carbon budget, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. When we cancel that, it isn't a budgetary measure, but it's worth noting as a non-budgetary transaction, that frees up money for a different energy infrastructure project, which is enhancing our electricity grid across Canada so that we can get renewable electricity from one part of the country to another. We're also looking at closing a number of corporate loopholes, things like the stock option loophole, where if a senior executive is paid in stocks, the tax on that is far less than if they are paid at their income bracket, at the higher income bracket level. We're also looking at expanding some taxes to the e-commerce sector, things like Amazon, Google, Facebook. It's a relative, we're not overtaxing them, but right now they're undertaxed. We're also bringing in a wealth tax, but only on a small percentage of the income, of the wealth rather, of people who have $20 million or more in income. We're increasing the taxes on large transnational corporations and commercial banks, but we're holding at 9% the tax for small business because we recognize that small business is really the biggest employer and the economic driver. We want to do everything we can to assist small business.
Let me go back.
So there's some revenue items that are fairly substantial.
Okay, let me go back to, so the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the Liberal government bought it for $4.5 billion. It's there. You're talking today about saving money, no more expenditures on it. Then what happens to it?
Oh, well, those are two different pipelines. And this is often misunderstood among, well, certainly Canadians have this notion that we've bought a pipeline. We can't undo that, right? So the existing 65-year-old pipeline is something that the Canadian public now owns.
Right.
We're not undoing that. We can't. The Kinder Morgan took $4.5 billion to Texas. We can't get it back. We can stop building a second pipeline. It's called an expansion, but it doesn't build on the current pipeline. It's a completely new pipeline on some of the same route, but not all the same route. That would be up to, well, 10 to 13 billion is the current estimate. It would go up. That's public money we would not spend. We would invest that in a decarbonized electricity.
I guess my point is the purpose for the Liberal government's purpose for buying it was to then expand it and have the project go ahead. So you're saying that wouldn't have, so does it, I mean, that was the business case for it, that there's a reason.
There was never a business case. But it was a political expedient. They were embarrassed. Okay. They were embarrassed because Kinder Morgan was going to walk away and blame them instead of telling the truth, which was that Kinder Morgan didn't have customers. It didn't make long-term economic sense, and Kinder Morgan.
So how long does the existing pipeline survive if there's a Green government?
Well, the problem with the existing pipeline is that it's near the end of its lifetime, it's bringing leaks. We don't have a problem with the existing pipeline as long as we are using fossil fuels. There's an existing pipeline. We will not build a single new pipeline. There's no new fossil fuel infrastructure. We will ban fracking. We will cancel the subsidies to Canada LNG. Not only do we not need LNG, LNG is incompatible with achieving the climate goals. The ones that Justin Trudeau announced yesterday to the year 2050 are unachievable if you insist on building a Trans Mountain pipeline, insist on funding and subsidizing fossil fuels like LNG. So we have to say this is within the framework of what science tells us we have to do. We reduce our dependency on fossil fuels quite rapidly, 60% cuts against 2005 levels by 2030. And we have to take that into account in our budget as we do. Less oil and gas revenue, more of a focus on getting renewable energy up and running and into an electricity grid that allows us to go off the internal combustion engine within a decade or so.
Okay.
The details are there.
Okay, no increase in income taxes for Canadians.
No,
okay.
no increases.
There is a financial, I note in the platform, there's a financial transaction tax in the platform, 0.2%, but it's up to 0.5%
Yes.
when you release the costing today. Two different numbers.
Yes.
How come?
0.5 is correct because when we went through the budget, and we took a bit of a chance. We knew that Canadians deserved to see our full platform, the things we're committed to doing. And we didn't when we released that early in the writ period. We didn't have, I guess it was the first Monday after the writ drop on September 11th, we released our full platform. We knew when we did it that we were still awaiting a couple of line items from PBO. We also then had the $2 billion ruling from the Human Rights Tribunal in the case of Indigenous children. So in other words, we wanted to ensure a balanced budget. We were sure we could do it. But between launching the platform and releasing our budget, we had some tweaks. And that is a tweak of 0.2 to 0.5 financial transaction tax. We're actually now at the right number because that was what was always proposed by Nobel Prize winning economist James Tobin. We're now aligned with that. And there was a vote, believe it or not, in the Parliament of Canada in goodness knows what year now, probably 1995, to adopt the Tobin tax. So here we are, 0.5% tax on financial transactions.
Okay. How firm is your commitment to balance the budget in 5 years?
We have done so in our projections, but we're not ideological or slavish about it. If something came up, and given that the financial health of the Government of Canada is quite strong at this point, we are fiscally sustainable for the long term at the federal level, unlike some provincial governments, which are not, or the provincial governments overall. So looking at the financial health of the Government of Canada, we could stand more deficits, but we prefer not. So I think that's the right way to put it. Our hope is a balanced budget by within 5 years in 2025. That's what we've projected. If an untoward circumstance occurred, something like the 2008 financial disaster, that started in another country and so on, if that began to hit us, we would say, well, we need to spend more money because we need to stimulate the economy. Right now, looking forward, we don't think we'll need to do that. We think we can balance the budget in 2025.
All right. We know the Green Party focus, and you've already released it, Mission Possible. We know the Green Party focus on climate, but I want to get your quick reaction here to a couple of what the other parties are doing. The Liberals promising net zero carbon emissions by 2050. They announced that yesterday. Not much in the way of details. What do you think of what you heard?
Well, it's the right target for 2050, but it's conveniently 30 years away from this election and political accountability. Long-term targets without details have, and I've been working on this issue now since 1986, I know how this story plays out. Nobody does anything because the target's too far away. That's why the Green Party target is double Canada's current target. Justin Trudeau and the Liberals should have, in 2015, within weeks of getting elected, when they went to Paris in December 2015, should have announced that the Harper target was history and that this country was going to do the right thing. In 2018, and on October 8th, when the IPCC warned all countries on Earth we're perilously close to a point of no return. We should have gone to the UN and said, we're pulling that old Harper target. We have to double it if we're serious. So if
the Liberals
Justin Trudeau was serious, you don't put a pie-in-the-sky target for 2050 without increasing your target to 2030 by doubling it. We're the only party committed to doing what science dictates we must do.
And the Liberals are still saying they're going to reach the 2030 targets that I know you say aren't sufficient anyway. And there's lots of evidence that they're not doing it now. But
they're not only not sufficient, they're almost criminal at this point. We're talking about whether our kids survive, right? We're not talking about a hypothetical future. Greta Thunberg, when she addressed the United Nations, is exactly right. Her future is on the line, as are the futures of my grandchildren, all of our children. And it's not that by 2030 the world will fall apart. But if we don't adjust our economy towards a transformational effort to go off carbon, and if we don't do that in the next 18 months, you can't make the transition to a zero carbon economy by 2050 if you don't start now. We're kind of 30 years late to get started if we're serious.
Let's finish on this. This final question. Andrew Scheer today is promising a refundable tax credit of 20% on income taxes for people who make green improvements to their homes. He's taking a different approach with some of these refundable tax credits and suggesting that there's a way to have industry do this and meet the targets. Measures like this, what do you think they do to the fight against climate change?
Listen, that's a great idea on its own. The problem is that Scheer's climate plan is a plan for increasing emissions through magical thinking that somehow fossil fuels burned in other countries don't contribute to global climate disaster, and we can help the world by exporting our magical fossil fuels, which don't do what every chemist will tell you it does. So we know from science that we have to globally stop being dependent on fossil fuels as rapidly as possible. And certainly what's required, according to the IPCC, is globally 45% reductions by 2030. Because Canada is a laggard, the target we must have in Mission Possible is 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. So the individual tax measure that Andrew Scheer has announced today, bring it on. Great idea. We have to completely renovate all the buildings in Canada to eco-energy efficiency standards by 2030. It's a tall order, and let's make sure we use all the tools in the toolbox. The problem with Scheer's policy, which is, of course, other than Maxime Bernier, the worst on climate, the problem with the Liberal policy, which is vague, a commitment to 2050, but nothing in place for 2030, except the old Harper target. And then you look at the NDP that have really good rhetoric, but their target is only 38% below 2005 by 2030 when you crunch the numbers. We should be doing this together. Partisanship isn't helping us. Of course, we're in an election campaign. Right. I'd like to find the best bits out of everybody's platform and say, okay, but can we all agree that we have to be driven by science? And science tells us that we have to go off fossil fuels quite sharply, and at least 60% by 2030.
All right, Elizabeth May, good to talk to you today, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.